I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today, our guest is Adele Tomlin. Adele is a British writer, scholar, translator, and practitioner of Tibetan and Vajrayana Buddhism. She has degrees in Tibetan Buddhism and Western philosophy, and since 2006 has been studying Tibetan language and Buddhist philosophy in India and Nepal. She is also the founder, director of the first female-founded research and translations website on Tibetan Buddhism and Vajrayana called Dakini Translations. I thought we could begin on the earthly realm of if you've come across specific teachings or yogic relationships where relationships is a means for liberation, but really more in like the everyday living.
Right. Okay. Sure. Well, yeah, this is a really interesting question because a lot of what I write about is relationship in the Tantric context, as you know, to look at how that and if that does transplant into ordinary relationship is a very good question. A lot of people like myself are lay people and they are not monastic and they're in relationships or they want to be in relationships. And Tantric union or the celibacy, which maybe we'll talk about as well, is just not so relevant to them, right? So this question about can relationships, lead one into liberation is a very interesting one. But I think the thing is with the sort of, if we're talking about as a sort of romantic or let's say a sexual relationship, that is problematic to say that kind of relationship in itself can lead one to liberation within the Buddhist context. Of course, as you know, there are the 6 parameters of, patience, compassion, and, diligence, all these kinds of mental states we can develop within relationships with it, not just in our romantic relationships, but in relationships with our children, as a mother, as a lover, but even as a friend. So I think in that respect, relationships have always been the most fertile ground in a way for developing the required mental states, the parameters to attain liberation, because without those mental states, we cannot actually attain liberation. But of course, the most important parameter, if you like, is the view of emptiness. And all the great masters and all the texts have said that if you have not realized emptiness, you are not able to yourself to become liberated, but you cannot even lead other people to liberation, right? In that respect, I guess the good news is, yes, relationships are extremely useful to bring one to liberation, not just romantic relationships. But on the other hand, for example, if we haven't realized the view of emptiness, then we cannot be liberated. And in fact, if we have a teacher who has not realized emptiness on some level, what they call the path of seeing level, which is the Arya, the first Bhumi level, that person cannot lead us to liberation either. So the thing is with the sort of idea of liberation is that, sex is in a way, or sexual union or romantic relationships are very important to us. But the problem is that they can also be great sources of suffering, as I'm sure you know.
Very true. And I'm thinking of the listener that's like, well, I have not realized emptiness. How can I use my relationships as a means? And curious your thoughts on that.
Well, yes. I mean, this is the difficulty with the path. So the path to liberation, it isn't an easy one. That is the thing. I think that people, it's sometimes very difficult to accept that in the culture we all live in, right? We like getting things here and now, and it's like with anything in life, you really do, unfortunately, especially to sort of realize emptiness, you really have to put in that work, that effort to meditate on it, to do these kind of meditations. Now, I guess in one way, a relationship could help with that. For example, when we are experiencing difficulties, one of the foundational meditations is to meditate on impermanence, which in itself is connected into emptiness. So through that, we can then bring, they call it, right, bringing suffering onto the path. We can bring all those sort of difficulties we have in relationships, romantic ones, work relationships, colleagues, all of those things. We can, as much as we can try and bring that into our practice of, again, I'll go back to the 6 parameters here, which is where we're trying to develop the mind states of patience or compassion. And so to realize emptiness, of course, one has to also realize and have a good foundation of bodhicitta. And bodhicitta, for those who are maybe, listening, who aren't so familiar with that, what does that mean? Well, it actually means really developing genuine love and compassion for all beings, regardless of how they act towards us. So relationships are very useful. There is no denying it. I would say my sort of biggest kind of, if you like, realizations or sort of connection to emptiness, or what bodhicitta might be like, is through my relationships. The example of the mother is always used in Buddhism, and that's not an accidental thing. I'm sure there are many mothers out there who went through the COVID lockdown, recently, with two years here in India. There were no schools. It was all shut, and in other countries as well. And I think for many mothers, for example, that was one of the most challenging times of their entire life, because they had to basically be in these very closed environments with children who had no school, who were very bored, who couldn't interact. And so in a way, those sorts of relationships, even though it can be extremely difficult and very painful in a way, can be the most fertile ground actually to bring one onto the path of liberation. I really believe that, yeah.
I'd actually love to get into the topic of love and what is love from the Buddhist perspective, maybe Buddhist Tantra perspective, if there's a difference between the two. Maybe start there.
Yeah. Yes, well, this is, of course, everyone wants love and to be loved, right? That's the thing. And from the Buddhist perspective, especially, there is not one sentient being really that does not want to feel in some way, I guess, this is where the word bliss might be more suitable, but some kind of satisfaction. And a lot of that satisfaction, particularly in humans, sort of, but also with animals, I would say, comes from feeling loved, or from loving as well. Now, what is the difference then between ordinary love and, let's say, Buddhist or Tantric love? What is love then? Well, this is a question that, many musicians and artists have really tried to also grapple with right now. In the Buddhist view, it's very simple. Actually, it's really wanting other people to be genuinely happy. And when we say happy, often that word in English, right, it has a very kind of connotation of what is happy. We feel like it's kind of doing nice things and feeling good, and it is connected to that. But obviously, happiness in the Buddhist context is not actually just some sort of worldly kind of pleasures, or feeling good. Having a massage is good, but it's not really what is going to make us happy. So, in a long-term way, as we all know, we have a massage and we feel good about it, but it wears off, right? And it's the same with our relationships, everything that we do for those sorts of happy sort of feelings. We all know they don't last. So what is love in the Buddhist context? It's really saying that, it's really wanting other people to be happy, really wishing them that kind of love, but understanding that what we normally maybe think of as happiness is not what maybe most people are associating with happiness, right? So if I'm trying to be a Buddhist practitioner and develop love, what I'm trying to do is think, I really wish that person or those people or those beings will attain really sort of long-lasting happiness, which, from the Buddhist context is liberation. from samsara is liberation from suffering. And so this is where sort of love from a Buddhist perspective or from a practitioner even might seem like it's not even love sometimes, right? So from a worldly perspective, people might see someone doing or saying things which to them look like it's a kind of almost, let's say, aversion or even anger. But it can be actually love if it's undertaken because, for example, going back to the mother example again, sometimes, immature beings or children just don't listen, right? And they're putting themselves in all sorts of very dangerous and risky situations. And so at that time, there comes a point where out of love, the sort of method has to be a bit more wrathful or a bit harsher, let's say. And to external eyes, they might look at that and think, well, that doesn't look very loving. And this is where I think it gets interesting because our worldly notion of love is sometimes a very sort of self-centered one, right? So we look at love as what I can get from a person. How do they make me feel? Do they make me feel happy or not? And we all have this. I mean, I'm not saying I don't, and this is why we suffer in relationships, because when all of a sudden that person that we thought we loved, right, but actually what we wanted was them making us continue to feel good from their side, when that changes, all of a sudden we don't feel like we love them anymore, right? So that is the difficulty, is that it's from the Buddhist view, that is why our romantic relationships don't really last. But even where our relationships with our family or with children or whatever also face a lot of difficulties, is because fundamentally, and again, this is maybe not, people don't really want to hear this, maybe, is we don't actually love people as much as we think we do. So, and that can be painful to acknowledge in some ways, because we often think, especially with our family or our friends, that we really do love those people. And in some ways we do want them to be happy, and we do rejoice when good things happen to them. But those things can be very fragile, right? I mean, we've all had experiences of people we thought we had this love for, romantic relationships being the prime example, but all of a sudden something happened, or a friend said something or did something which we just felt so offended by, and all of a sudden our love for them has completely gone. But actually what that situation showed us was that we didn't actually really love them. So
yeah. No, I really appreciate that. I think it's also just very complex what you're sharing. The process, goes back to the journey of emptiness. It actually, I think sometimes, just from hearing what you're sharing, sometimes we underestimate what it takes to love, to be someone that genuinely loves. We think it's such a light word, right, thrown around for everything. And yet it's such a journey to learn how to be really here for the benefit of somebody else. And were things ever different? Do you think people understood love in a different way at other times?
Well, that's a good question. And I think there is a kind of nostalgia maybe for romantic love, and that there was, or, things were better in the past. And so looking at the Buddha's life, looking at why he left his family and why he left his wife, and all that wealth and all that sort of luxury. And that was what, sort of 2,500 so years ago, right? And so what we learn from the stories of the Buddha and at that time in India is that actually, no, things were not necessarily better. And the issues regarding attachment and suffering and, not real love connected to relationships, I think, are very much present in the past as well. And so that the kind of fundamental, what Buddha, I think, showed us is that unfortunately, generally speaking, not just humans, but I think generally all beings, we don't really have a sort of genuine understanding or application of love. But then, he did see the example, obviously, of the mother. Of course, this is an archetype. Not everyone has a great loving mother, but the archetype is, this loving mother. Why? Because she does represent, in a way, as close as possible in the human realm, I think, to this unconditional love, and really someone who really wants the best for that being, for the whether it's humans or whoever they are. They just really do not want them to suffer. So in answer to your question, I don't think it necessarily was better in the past, even though maybe a lot of people maybe think it is or was, I don't know.
Yeah. And what do you, going back to the topic of bliss and love, will you differentiate
Yes.
the two? How are bliss and love different?
Well, yeah. Well, I think in a way they are very closely connected. When we are really in a place of love and we are really rejoicing so love and rejoicing are also very closely connected. So, when you love beings, you rejoice when they are happy or they do have good things happening to them, and, they are moving closer to liberation or so on. So that kind of rejoicing, that kind of joy, that kind of loving state is in itself, in a way, you're really connecting then into the sort of ultimate nature, which, as you know, is referred to as bliss, in union with emptiness. So bliss contains those sort of qualities of love, of joy, of compassion, but that in itself, without that dualism. So the bliss, in a way, is kind of that energy of love and joy and compassion and all of that beautiful sort of mental states of the Buddha nature. But obviously there isn't that ego sort of dualistic side to it. And so in a way, maybe that's how it's different from love, because it's more just the sort of being of being rather than, I guess, the more sort of dualistic notion.
Bringing this also to, I'm really appreciating that we get a space today to clarify misunderstandings and offer some definitions and in the Buddhist context, and in terms of bliss emptiness union versus ordinary union. We also elaborate a little bit on that as we're bringing all these.
Yes, well, this is actually one of my favorite topics, because, and I think many people are very attracted to and interested in this topic, right? So because, what are we talking about when we talk about sort of union, and when we talk about tantric union? And for example, the deities are all pictured in this kind of unions, actually sexual unions. And so how does that interconnect with this sort of more profound idea of this emptiness? So, and this is where I think, going back to your initial question, where you were talking about sort of romantic relationships, how can they help us on the path to liberation? Well, of course, the tantric union, which is attempting to bring about within a union this sort of bliss emptiness, is one of the most profound methods of love and liberation, in a way, that is available to us human beings on this planet. And in that respect, it's a very precious thing. But sadly, it's because it's so prevalent, I guess, these days, there's a lot of misunderstanding about it and what it actually involves and who can do it. So in a way, for someone to engage in a tantric union, there has to be, first of all, there has to be that sense of a lack of attachment and a genuine love. If you're going to do it with a partner, let's say, if you're going to attempt this, then that would be kind of a basic minimum, that you are not just, this is kind of where, the idea of Kama Mudra or tantric union, it can get misused in a way, because although, of course, it can bring you into much higher states of bliss and orgasm, on the other hand, if there is attachment there, and if it's being done predominantly for those reasons, again, the bad news is that although it can improve your relationship, and in that way, sexually, it would be good for the relationship, let's say, but on the other hand, it's a technique which is really supposed to be used in the context of liberation. So if you're doing it really more to get a great orgasm, which, you know, I'm not knocking. I mean, that, you know, of course, that is something that so many people would like. So many people's sexual lives are not necessarily that satisfactory either, right? And they cannot necessarily even reach an orgasm in a relationship or a union with their partner, and they don't feel able to talk about that, you know, and they're not even in a culture where one would talk about that. So tantric methods are very useful for that. But on the other hand, they are not primarily supposed to be used for that. So now this is where there's some sort of debate, I think, about, you know, is it okay to sort of share these methods so publicly with people who may be just really interested in them for a more worldly reason, right? Now, this is an interesting debate, and I'm not completely like decided on it, because on the one hand, like yoga, so, you know, I'm in India, and of course, India is the land of yoga. And when I first came to India, it was to study yoga, actually, my first trip here. And yoga, of course, is a lifestyle. It's a path of, you know, physical exercise, but it's about diet, it's about pranayama, you know, it's got all of that associated with it. But as we all know, you know, the way that has been transplanted into sort of particularly maybe Western cultures, but not just Western cultures, I think everywhere, is quite removed from that nowadays. And some people would say, well, that's not really yoga, is it? And they would have a point maybe, but on the other hand, if, you know, those techniques are helping people in some way be healthier, feel more peaceful and better people, well, you know, that has to be a good thing, right? I mean, we already have so much suffering in the world. Why would we knock, you know, methods which are actually increasing people's sense of well-being and happiness? And I would say the same is true parts of the tantric union methods. You know, if people really feel that improves their relationships and their sexual lives, then on one hand, why not, you know, or makes them feel healthier. But on the other hand, you know, the big caveat is, let's not kid ourselves here that what you're doing is really tantra or sort of yoga. Actually, I think there needs to be some understanding that there's a limit to this. And unfortunately, if you're not doing it for liberation purposes, or you're not doing it with bodhicitta for the benefit of others, let's say, as the foundation, then those methods are not going to ultimately give you that sort of sense of real happiness and satisfaction. I think that's the whole thing with Tantra and Tantric practice. And I think also the danger is people who engage in Tantric practice, if they are very addicted to sex or have a lot of sexual desire, the biggest danger is that it increases that, right? So this is what we're kind of seeing in the world today, is that, you know, there are these kind of scandals, more and more scandals coming out of women who feel used, who feel they've engaged in sort of these relationships with someone they thought was, you know, using it on a spiritual path, you know, and myself included in that. And yet, you know, afterwards they sort of found that actually the person who they thought was doing it for those reasons, who they thought loved them and had compassion for them and had these realizations, were actually, it was a kind of a sexual thing. It was actually not really, so they didn't feel sort of better after it. They felt abused and used, and they felt their bodies were just used as an object. And I think that is why we're starting to see a lot more and more as women, obviously as women in the 20th century, and particularly in this century, are finding their voices more and more, becoming more visible online, or becoming more visible as teachers, translators, practitioners. We are starting to be able to voice this. Before, I think in the past, in Tibet or in India or in Nepal, for example, And even now, I think it's very difficult for women to sort of really speak about this. I mean, the most famous example is Sera Khandro, right? Who in her autobiography did mention some of these things. And then, of course, we have the work of, scholars like, Sarah Jacobi, who have managed to put these in book form and really talk about some of the really big difficulties she went through quite recently, not that long ago. So I think those sorts of books or those sorts of, lives about women, and even, the reason I set up this website, and as I mentioned in the video introduction to it, was because I also felt there was this major lack of a sort of, and there were so many kind of male gatekeepers in the academic and the translation world, that I really felt that there was a space for this, and there was a need for it as well. And it's not that there aren't female academics or scholars or translators. Of course there are, and there are more and more coming through, which is great. But I just wanted it to sort of have as a sort of an example, if you like, almost just to show other women that, look, do not allow the sort of male gatekeepers to sort of, prevent you from following your dream or what you want to do in the Dharma, So anyway, that's
I'm following you. I'm liking all the places you're bringing us to, and there's so much in there. Okay. And I'm also wondering the connection between what you're sharing right now in terms of how love is misused in many ways. Like, is there something that's getting bypassed? That's a preamble question. And then, also talking about celibacy and how does that fit into the tantric path?
Well, yes. I mean, the question about love is it being bypassed, or is it sort of being misinterpreted? And I don't like to sort of stereotype between men and women. I actually sort of think that gender stereotypes are not very useful. But I think there is a sense where women in particular have felt that the sort of, particularly because of course most of the teachers in Tibetan Buddhism are male still. And it is a very male dominated tradition, there is no doubt, because of the tulku system predominantly. But yeah, I think so women have felt that the male teachers, if you like, have a sort of, their understanding of love seems to be at odds with what they feel that love is about in the Buddhist tradition. And so this idea of lack of attachment, for example, which is often cited as well, as though lack of attachment is detachment. And this is something that I always sort of try to sort of clarify in a way as well through my own writing, is that lack of attachment is not the same as detachment, because detachment is actually a very cold, almost kind of aversion, and almost kind of a sort of sociopathic, psychopathic type state to be in, right? Because if you're detached, and that means you sort of have no sort of emotion really for the person, particularly with unions. Well, actually, you're actually kind of closer to someone who's, acting in a very sort of, almost sociopathic way. That's how they feel. When you look at the text, or you look at what the great masters have said, they all sort of really emphasize that when you have a lack of attachment, a lack of ego, a lack of duality, let's say, then your feelings of love and compassion and it's kind of, should increase more, right? Because your ego isn't involved. So in some ways, this is where I think maybe, again, with sort of men in particular, with teachers in particular, they somehow, for some reason, they have misinterpreted love, lack of attachment, to mean detachment. And I think this leads into this other question or issue, which is about monasticism and how monastics, for example, male monastics, monks, are taught from a very early age to regard women, to regard the female body as something which is dirty and filthy and to be regarded as a source of disgust, right? But then at the same time, you know, they want to still, it seems, do these sort of tantric unions, and so they somehow seem to have, how are they mentally doing that? It seems to me anyway that they are trying to use this kind of disgust, or what they see as a lack of attachment, to sort of approach women, but still do the unions with them. And I think what happens is because this detachment aspect that they see as sort of re-emphasizing the fact they're monastics and they have no attachment or desire for women, it actually just leads to a disaster for women and the monk, because women, especially if they're not monastic, which most of them actually seems like aren't, but obviously nuns are used as consorts as well, is that they feel, hang on a second, you know, you might want to sort of preserve your monasticism and all of that, but I'm feeling like you don't have any love and compassion for me at all. And I think this goes into the sort of then the next question, which is celibacy. So, I mean, one of the subjects I'm looking at the moment and doing some research on is how compatible are the Vinaya, the monastic rules, with Vajrayana Tantra, right? Because from what I can see, and a lot of other people can see, is that a lot of these kind of scandals or sort of experiences, for example, like I've had, but other women have had, are connected to monks trying to still do Vajrayana in a consort practice. So we can get onto that, but with the celibacy, I mean, shall I talk a little bit about celibacy?
Please.
Just tell me to stop. With the celibacy issue, of course, one of the things that you said to me you're quite interested in as well was this idea that I've written about, where some of the best tantric practitioners are celibate, and celibate monks even, right? Now, of course, this is a provocative thing to say, but on the other hand, it's also true in a way. Now, why did I write that? So I wanted to provoke in some way some sort of debate about this, because of course most people would be like, how can celibate practitioners be some of the best tantric practitioners in the world? You know, for example, the 14th Dalai Lama, the 17th Karmapa, they're both monks, right? So how is it possible that a celibate monk would be able to be an extremely advanced tantric practitioner? And this is, I think, where the misunderstanding of sex and tantric union starts to appear, because what people's reactions are to that is, no, that's not possible. How can someone be celibate and do tantric practice as a union? So the texts are very clear on this, though, you know. So if you look in the sort of tantric texts, like the Kala Chakra Tantra, for example, you know, it's really clear that you can be celibate, monastic, and engage in consort practice and maintain your celibacy. So how is that possible? Because the whole idea of a union is not for sex, right? It's not out of desire. It's being done for liberation. And the practitioner should be able to retain the bodhicitta, as they call it in the sort of Vajra language, but what they're talking about, they should be able to, you know, stop ejaculation and bring it right up the central channel, and do that for the partner as well. Now, a great advanced practitioner can do that. They absolutely can do that. I know this from my own experience. But the problem is that, and you know, and that's brilliant and that's great, and it can be extremely blissful for both people concerned. You know, I would say, and I have said, certainly the tantric union is without a doubt 1,000,000 times better than any ordinary sexual relationship I've ever had. So, you know, it's like, you know, why would you go back to that, when you've experienced the sort of bliss of that? So there is that element to it, which is just, unbelievably amazing. And if you can bring that into your practice, then it's fantastic. But as I was saying before, the thing with the celibacy is that it's possible to be celibate and do that because it's not seen as a sexual act. But the problem is the question is, again, is there love and compassion behind it? If it's a monastic in particular, what are their views of women? Have they been, so kind of institutionalized in this view of women that there is this kind of underlying misogyny and sexism in it, And so that's a Vajrayana root downfall, as you probably know. I mean, if a monastic engages in a union with a woman, and he might be able to do all of that. He might have the siddhis, the salon. He might be able to do all of that. But at the end of the day, if the foundation of the love and compassion and the foundation of emptiness, but particularly the respect for women, which is the 14th root downfall of the Vajrayana, if that is lacking, well, the whole thing will actually end up being a disaster for both people. And I believe this is kind of what we're seeing. But then someone might say, well, why is it good to be a celibate? Why would celibacy be necessary to engage in tantric union? Because there's a reason for celibacy. It is not just a kind of a Vinaya vow or a vow that should have just been imposed from above. And this again is the sort of question. Probably most monastics within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition were put in monasteries as children, and it wasn't really a freely available choice to be celibate. But the celibacy vow should also be a source of joy. It should be something that really energizes oneself and really one undertakes with the understanding, well, what is its purpose here? The celibacy vow is to reduce sexual desire and attachment and to really clean out your channels, the closest I can come to it. Because, I've been celibate now for I would say, I've had celibacy vows now for 7 years. And I initially took them because I experienced a breakup of a relationship and I wanted to, I saw the suffering, I think, in romantic relationships, and I wanted to do something very practical, and I decided to take the vow myself, and then because I was then engaged in doing these tantric unions and so on, it became very easy to keep it. And so that myself then made me reflect on, well, what is the celibacy vow for? And I actually think a lot of it's about cleaning out your inner channels. So when we have a lot of relationships, especially sexual relationships, but even if we are monogamous, we are carrying the energy of that person, but also the other people we've had previous relationships with, right? We're carrying that with us all the time. And so when you go celibate, it's kind of almost like you're doing a fast, like a sexual fast, but you're actually, I mean, the great thing about it is that, it's like, I don't know if you've heard this, but, they say, for example, someone who smoked for years, if they stop smoking, it takes them a certain amount of time before their lungs completely clear out, right? And I'm not saying that our relationships are like sort of smoking, but although they can be depending on who it's with, but it's kind of, I feel like that. So the celibacy not only is to kind of try and mentally reduce your sexual desire and attachment, but also kind of really give your inner Vajra body a clean out, really clean out those channels. And this is why actually tantric practitioners will often do consort practice with a nun or with a young woman.
You often hear in texts or teachers talk about the ripe 16-year-old girl, and I loved, I would love to hear the true meaning of that.
Right, exactly. Because, for women like ourselves, who are not 16 and who are not virgins, that can seem kind of off-putting. It sounds a bit kind of sexist, patriarchal, like it's like, older women are just But on the other hand, there are so many examples of women who were not young when they attained liberation, when they became consorts. And again, this kind of goes back to my other point about celibacy, clean channels, is why is the young woman mentioned, or even the virgin mentioned? Because actually, perhaps at that time, particularly in India or Nepal, most women, were married and were not celibates or were not virgins. And so in a way, their channels, again, were not so clean. Now, it is important to have quite clean channels to do it properly. And I think that is one of the reasons why the young woman or the virgin was emphasized. But in this day and age, women, or even prostitutes, I mean, but then you have the other example, which is that, you have people like Tilopa, who was told to be the servant of a low caste prostitute, a poor prostitute in India, and be a servant to her, which he did for 12 years by his female teacher. He was told to do that. Now, in that context, she felt that he had too much pride, and so she wanted to reduce that. So again, and this is the thing about Vajrayana, there are all these sort of contradictory examples where, you have a Mahasiddha like Tilopa, who was his consort and who he also brought to liberation, was a very poor lower caste Indian prostitute. And obviously that would not be a glamorous thing at all. That would be a really, at that time, that would be considered to be an extremely disgusting thing to be doing and being involved with. It's not like, nowadays we refer to sort of women who do this by choice as sex workers, right? I don't think it was like that at all. And I certainly don't think that Tilopa was treated very well. But going back to the sort of celibacy and the young woman, I think that there's also it's also symbolic. I think people also forget this. So, for example, energetic unions. Why can you be celibate and do tantric unions? Well, if you have sufficient salon practice and you're very good and you can basically use your subtle body and emanate your subtle body out, then of course, and this is written about in books. I mean, it's not that secret. Khenpo Sujun Gyamso Rinpoche, he's kind of referred to it in some of his books, which is called the Invisible Union. And he talks about this as being the purest one, because of course, then there's no sort of sense that you're using your physical body, right? But the thing is and so then of course physical age is irrelevant, right? Because if you're engaging with someone in an energetic body level, what's important there is your mind, is your channels, and so in some of the texts, they say the 16-year-old actually refers to the sort of 16 joys, or it's a symbolic thing, or if, I heard the 17th Karmapa teach recently that it refers to the freshness of a person's mind, so a 16-year-old, why are we sort of envisaging ourselves as Tara or Vajrayogini or as a sort of 16-year-old, this beautiful 16-year-old, is because what it's trying to get us into is this kind of state of sort of real kind of almost innocence, but also playfulness of that beautiful sort of mind, of that kind of freshness. And this is what he said. And I found that very interesting that he said this recently, that this is what we're trying to get into here. We're talking about a 16-year-old, not in this physical way, but actually in the sort of energetic way, that the Tantra is all about energy, right? So we're talking about getting into that state of a 16-year-old, innocent, playful, fresh kind of mind, and it's kind of got that purity to it, right? So in that respect, I can totally get it, and I think it helps us, because as adults, we can become so jaded, we can become so what's the word, like cynical or something, we become so. And when we, if we try and visualize ourselves as a 16-year-old, we try and get back into that mind state, it can be very helpful, I think, to sort of really bring out that sort of almost joyfulness at that age as well, sort of you're very open, you're very fresh, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And will you, talking about celibacy, will you also discuss the meaning of renunciation?
Yes. Oh, well, this is also, I think, a very interesting topic for people who are lay practitioners in particular. So I've had conversations with um, practitioners that I know who really think that this whole idea of renunciation is just not relevant for a lay person in the 21st century. And on the one hand, I sort of agree with them. You know, the monastic lifestyle. I'm writing up some teachings at the moment that the 17th Karmapa is giving, which is on the monasticism on the Vinaya. It's very, very interesting. But there's a point, I think, where a lot of people will read it and just thinking, gosh, that really isn't for me, and with good reason, because lay practitioners, householders, they were included as the fourfold Sangha by the Buddha. He absolutely included them, and they are a valid part of the Buddhist Sangha. And again, it just seems that, well, maybe the whole monasticism, and this is something that I'm going to be writing about and talking about also in the near future, is this whole issue of how monasticism has kind of hijacked, in a way, or sort of maybe monasticism is the wrong word, but a certain kind of monasticism, a certain kind of monasticism, particularly in Tibet, that kind of became very predominant in Tibet from the time of Tsongkhapa, let's say, from the Gelug sort of time, when the sort of Vinaya and the rules became sort of more very rigid and important. Is that sort of kind of monasticism, in a way, it's kind of hijacked the sort of idea that lay practitioners are very much half of the Sangha, of the Buddhist Sangha as set up by the Buddha, but also that in the Vajrayana, for example, I mean, most of these great Vajrayana practitioners and Mahasiddhas had to leave the monasteries. They could not have this kind of monastic lifestyle of renunciation, let's say, and practice Vajrayana. So I think that the monasticism, or the monastic idea of renunciation, is actually maybe misleading sometimes. So what does renunciation mean, in my opinion, in terms of the sort of terminology or how the word was used originally? As a translator, it's nejong, in Tibetan is nejong, which actually translators have generally translated this as renunciation, right? But actually in Tibetan, that's actually not what it means. Now, so actually, in a way, and this is something that, again, the Karmapa taught about a few times, is this word nejong, and the renunciation in English not being a good way to translate it. So what nejong means is really, nge is like really definitively or certainly, and jung is wanting to emerge. So it's like definitively or certainly wanting to emerge. What are we talking about? We want to emerge from. We're talking about samsara. So it's very different kind of feel to it, right, than renunciation. It's a very positive almost thing. Nejong, if translated actually as close as possible to the Tibetan, is actually a positive state of wanting to emerge from samsara. Now, renunciation in English, as you know, it's a very loaded word, and most people think, oh, I have to abandon everything. I have to become a very simple monastic, no possessions, don't enjoy anything. That is a path. There is no denying that is a path, and that is a way to attain liberation through that kind of very strict discipline and that kind of path. But on the other hand, you can be a renunciate, you can have nejong and still very much enjoy things, and you can be a layperson, you can enjoy things, and it's not like you have to abandon everything. But the key point is that if you really have this kind of nejong, wishing to emerge, you no longer place so much emphasis on those things. For example, clothes or shoes or food or whatever it is, because it's much easier to not become so attached to those things if you're a monastic, right? It's much easier to have sort of renunciation, if you like, if you don't have those things. But the point is that you can, as a layperson, want to emerge from samsara without having to sort of be in this very monastic lifestyle of a very simple monastic. And that's something that I also want to write more about. I want to address more, is looking at that. So to kind of encourage people not to sort of see a Buddhist practitioner or, you know, renunciation, it is a fundamental part of the path. There is no denying it. It is the basis of the path, actually. But what does that mean? Does that mean we all have to go and be monastics in monasteries? Actually, no, it doesn't. I mean, it's a path, it's a very good one. But on the other hand, we can stay householders, we can stay as lay people, but still have a very, very strong wish to emerge from samsara and see that all these things that maybe we spend lots of money on and lots of time on are actually sources of suffering. And I think that is the sort of starting point of renunciation. And it really is as simple as that. So there will be monastics who do not have renunciation. So, you know, this is the other side of it, right? So just because you might have a beautiful house or a car or clothes, it doesn't mean you're not a renunciate. You might internally have a very strong sense of renunciation for samsara. But then on the other hand, you might be a monastic who has robes, who lives in a monastery, who does all the external rituals, but inside, in fact, the Karmapa mentioned recently in an interview he gave, in a sort of a speech he gave in 2019, that he never felt he got the monastic vows. And he gave this story of about John Tumpa, but he was saying that, and you can watch it, it's 2019 Kagyu Monlan video, but, you know, he's talking about how, why did he never feel he got the monastic vows? Because when they were given to him, he didn't have this inner renunciation. And he mentioned this story of a famous master who he only felt that he became a monastic and got monastic vows when he'd really developed this inner renunciation. And but he'd been wearing the robes and living in a monastery for a long time before that. And I think that's a really good example, is that being a monastic either is not necessarily mean you have renunciation, right? You might actually have a lot of desire and attachment to all sorts of worldly things, you know, physical objects, wealth, and in some ways be worse than a lay person or a householder in that respect, right? Who might actually have really a sense of, yeah, this isn't actually that important anymore, you know, and they're not craving those things anymore.
Yeah, I feel like what you're sharing too, again, points to the journey of, even if one takes a vow, it's understanding over time that vow. Like even if one wants to renounce and emerge from samsara, for most of us, it takes all kinds of experiences to have true motivation and to really be at that place where it's lived. And I think sometimes we discount the process of becoming.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's all that sort of contrast between what's on the outside and what's on the inside. And, you know, in Tibetan, the word for Buddhist, I don't know, maybe you already know this. Do you know this? The word for Buddhist in Tibetan?
Nampa?
Yeah. Yeah, it's Nampa, exactly. Yeah. And so, you know, that in itself is actually a major, I mean, that's very, very interesting, right? Is the Tibetans, I mean, of course, you can say Sangyepa, which is like a, you know, following Buddha, but, you know, actually Nampa is how most Tibetans refer to Buddhists. Are you a Nampa? Are you a Buddhist? And it means someone who's, you know, the inner. It's saying the inner, literally, and it's all about the inner. And I think this is where we have to really, you know, again, with the celibacy, with the Tantric union, with the vows, all of that, it all really comes back down to, look, what is happening on the inner level, right? Because you can wear the robes, you can have Nakpa robes, you can have all of this, but if that's not being matched internally, well, it's just a form of spiritual materialism, and therefore it's just another source of suffering. That's the tragedy of it. You know, it's not that, you know, sitting in judgment on people. We all have some kind of form of spiritual materialism because we all have some form of duality or ego until we're enlightened. But at the end of the day, if we really sort of think, okay, I've put this robe on now, I'm living in a monastery, you know, I've really got the renunciation. You might, it's possible you might, if you're doing it for the right reason, but you might not. You might be doing it for show. You might be doing it as an escape or something. So it's time and again, we always have to look within ourselves and say, okay, why am I really doing this? What is happening here, right?
Yeah, and then that's a safer bet that someone's going to live their life in integrity and use these practices in a conscious way. And I want to actually continue on the theme of the Karmapa, the 17th Karmapa, that is. And and you've translated many of his talks that you've been to, and this year you translated one that I really was drawn to on merit and karma. And specifically, he talked about how, like, why is it that bad things happen to good people? And it's a really big misunderstanding and a question many of us have, right, all the time. Like, why is it happening to that really good person? Or why are good things happening to, you know, so-called bad people? And will you share as well about karma and merit, you know, cause and effect and merit from the Buddhist perspective?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I should just say, of course, I'm not the Karmapa's translator. I have to just say that. I mean, this is something that I do as a sort of love, as a passion. I'm not asked to do these things, but you know, the reason I do it is I transcribe them and sort of go back into the original Tibetan. Is sometimes, you know, when I read the summaries and things that are published, they miss out lots of things, and so I do it out of a, you know, wanting to do it almost kind of for myself, but also for others who really want to hear exactly what he said. So I just wanted to sort of say that. I'm certainly not. But yeah, this idea of karma, of course, karma, cause and effect, is a fundamental cornerstone of Buddhist philosophy, right? Of the path. And so, and time and again, the teachings I go to, or the books I've read, time and again, it always emphasizes that, you know, one really has to get a really good, solid understanding of what this actually means. And yes, there is this sort of misinterpretation of it, understandably so, because people say, well, look, you know, that happened, that really nice person. Yeah, why are things happening that, you know, and other people, they're doing all these things, like really awful things, and yet they're having these great lives and nothing seems to be happening to them, you know. So that's the appearance level of it, right? And that's what makes life seem so unfair. It's just, yeah, why are some people also, you know, they die very young, or someone's been so healthy all their life, they've had a great diet, and, you know, they just drop from a heart attack, and it's like, but I don't understand. And then someone who's smoking, you know, 40 cigarettes a day, and they live until they're sort of 90 years old or something. It's of course that doesn't always happen, as we know, but you know, that's the point. And so, of course, you know, the way it can be represented, karma, is, oh, well, you know, that's their karma, isn't it? You know, and that sounds really sort of, to a non-Buddhist as well, I'm sure that sounds really like awful. How could you just say that? You know, I mean, and in a way it kind of misrepresents it. And again, this is why it's a kind of a tough truth. It's like the sort of not really loving people much, you know, thinking that you love people when actually you don't. And I would say that karma, cause and effect is a little bit like that. It's something that it's actually difficult to accept at a certain level, because no one wants to say, in some way, I caused this to happen to me. And it is about you. I mean, when we talk about karma, cause and effect, we should be really looking at our own situations here, you know. So when we point the finger outwards and say, oh, well, you know, that's their karma. Well, yes, on a sort of philosophical, let's say, or a sort of reality level, they are experiencing karma. Everyone's experiencing karma all the time. But we cannot sort of fundamentally say how that person's dealing with that karma, right? So we might see this poor person and think, oh, you know, they have the karma to be materially very poor in this life, right? As a Buddhist, you might think that. But for all we know, that person might be extremely happy and much happier than someone who sort of seems like they've got the karma of the wealth and the rich life, right? So this is the difficulty with sort of looking at karma just from the external, right? So for example, but even if they weren't, that doesn't mean that we should just say, oh, that's their karma, you know, we can forget about it. No, because we are supposed to be developing compassion and love. So karmically, we also kind of have an interconnection and a responsibility when people are in difficult situations to sort of, at the very least, develop some real compassion for them and actually maybe help them if we can. But especially for ourselves, this is the thing. Buddhism is about, it's the Nampa, it's the inner world. So what we should really be looking at is particularly for ourselves. So it's not kind of saying, oh, those people, never mind, we feel this pity for them. And that's a kind of a pity and compassion are quite different things, I think. But, it's actually saying, look, when things happen to me, when things are happening to me that I don't like, or I feel like this suffering, and I just questioning, why is this happening to me? I think that's when we should really try and apply this karma, cause and effect, because so often we always point outside, right? This person did this to me. That's why I'm suffering. We don't maybe consider the fact that maybe the reason why I can't get these things in my life, or I don't feel any love in my life, well, it could be because I haven't really given those sorts of things before previously, but maybe I'm not even giving those things now. But that kind of reflection requires a lot of almost maturity, right? I mean, it's like putting a mirror up. I mean, the mirror is often used as the example, the mirror of your mind. It's like you have to put a mirror up and be really honest about what you're seeing in that mirror. And if you don't like what you see, you have to change how you're looking at the mirror, right? So there's that great image, I don't know, maybe you've seen it, but there's two people in a prison and they have the bars on the window and the two prisoners are painting something. But anyway, so one prisoner is painting the trees and the environment outside the window, and the other prisoner is painting the bars on the prison window. So they're both focusing on very different things. And I think this is how, in a way, the idea of karma, how can we look at karma, and how can we, in a way, purify karma when it's happening to us, when we're sort of getting these karmic results that we don't really like very much. Is the only way, it seems, to effectively do that is really to change our perception of it. So we have to change our perception of why things are happening to us and why things are happening to other people. And so understanding that will allow us to, and the word here is maturity, because they talk about becoming a mature person, ripening. The word is maturing or ripening on the path. What does it mean to be a mature person? It actually means you're kind of having to take accountability, complete accountability for what is happening to you in your life right now. And there's no of this kind of very sort of trendy, if you like, or fashionable sort of, well, this person did this to me in my past, this person is this to me in my past. It really is just you. How can I take full accountability for what's happening to me in my life? And that's the thing. Immature people actually generally don't want to take accountability for anything, right? I mean, I'm not saying I'm super mature or anything, but I'm just saying that is the sort of sign, isn't it, of a sort of mature person and an immature person. An immature person is like the child. They're like, or the spoiled child, should I say? They're kind of always, well, this person, my parents were bad to me. Well, yes, and maybe they were, and that's not to diminish that. But how are you going to deal with that? Some of the women, I find some of the most inspiring examples of women, as I'm sure many other women do, are people like, for example, Maya Angelou, women who really have had the most sometimes really awful childhoods and backgrounds. And, I was watching Maya Angelou speak on a video I was watching recently about her childhood, and I love her poems. And she, and I just thought, this is a woman who's really mature, she's really taken full accountability for her life. And I didn't hear any sort of anger or hostility or aggression towards those people who actually had done really horrible things to her, as a child. And this is really amazing, you know, and I look at the Dalai Lama as well. When you think about, you know, obviously China, you know, invaded Tibet and occupying Tibet. I don't know if I can say that on here, maybe that's politically sensitive, but nonetheless, you know, he always, very rarely, I've ever heard him say very bad things in an angry way about the Chinese government. And he's always maintained this sense of, in fact, I think he was even asked who are the sort of people you admire the most. And he mentioned, I think it was, you know, the leader of the Chinese government who, you know, was when they invaded. He mentioned this person, and it was just like, how can you say this is a person you admire? I mean, I'm sure a lot of Tibetans were also, what? But I mean, that is the ultimate maturity, right? You are just literally saying we cannot point the finger out there. We have to at some point acknowledge that whatever these people are doing, whether they are motivated in horrible ways or good ways, we have to deal with that. And what is the best way to deal with that is to see these people as our teachers, as people who can provoke love and compassion in our minds. And in that respect, they are very valuable. Now, again, this is not something in a worldly perspective like karma, cause and effect. This is not something most people really would ever want to accept. But nonetheless, I think that is kind of, in a way, the only way you can really deal with suffering. And, you know, there's a famous book, for example, from a survivor of Auschwitz, you know, and he, you know, Man's Search for Meaning. When he looked in the camp and how people were being treated, and the people who were the most resilient and were able to sort of, you know, not commit suicide and really come through it, it was the people who were able to apply some sort of personal meaning to this kind of suffering. And so even though that's not a Buddhist context, you know, it has that sort of, I think this is the message here, which is, in a way, that's coming what karma is. In a way, that's what karma, cause and effect is. If you are saying, I am in this situation and something somehow got me here, but I am the one who has to deal with it. And so what is the most healthiest and most mature way to deal with it? Is it by getting angry, fighting, aggressive? Sometimes maybe yes, if it's done with sort of some love and compassion in it. But most of the time, no, because it just creates more suffering, right?
Since you are someone who's studied a lot of female practitioners and female lineages, would you share about one or two women that we might have not heard of already?
This is an interesting question, because these days we are learning more and more about women, female lineages. Myself, I've tried to write some articles bringing out some academic research that has been done on this to a more general audience, looking at some of these women who many people will not have heard about or be aware. So in that respect, there's been real progress, I think, in the last, let's say 10, 20 years, where we are now more aware of some of these women. But, you know, when I was thinking myself, well, you know, because it depends on who we are talking to, right? If we're talking to an audience which is more familiar now with these women, then maybe some of the people I might mention are already sort of quite obvious. But, you know, certainly, for example, in my section on the website, which I call Female Lineages, there are some women there that some people may not have heard of before. You know, and for example, if we go into the past, you know, one of the articles I wrote about sort of past was, for example, Tilopa's teachers or Naropa's teachers, and I call these the unsung heroines, you know, is that most people know about Tilopa, right? And there's this kind of refuge tree diagrams. And this, by the way, this is something that I'm kind of doing a project on at the moment, which is to bring out more of these women who are just kind of invisible, actually, visually and sort of in the text. And so, you know, one of the articles I wrote was about his teachers and his consort, you know, for example, the prostitute, you know, so there is suggestion that she obviously she was a lineage holder who transmitted a lot of text to her, but, you know, her name is Dagmema. But, you know, how much has been written about her? well, it's very hard to find anything. And I asked quite a lot of scholars, and so these are areas I think that could do some work. But also, there is, for example, Marpa the translator, his wife. So this is another female lineage holder who not only lived with Marpa, but was also a teacher to Milarepa. She, she's a very interesting figure that, again, people might not associate her as being a female lineage holder, right? But actually, when you think about it, she was Marpa's wife, and she was like a teacher to Milarepa. So I think, in terms of past examples, I think those are women, certainly, that I'm sort of quite interested in. But then, if we look at more recent examples, I recently wrote an article about it's like she's actually called Freda Bedi. I mean, there's been some books written about her now. You're probably aware of her, as other people are. But one of the interesting things that I found with her is that, she was actually, in a way, the first female Dharma translator, particularly of the head of a lineage. Okay, so with the 16th Karmapa. I mean, prior to that, I wasn't aware, and I haven't heard of any other women who were actually translators for heads of a lineage, for example. But even just generally, there are female translators of text, but not that many. But in a way, she was the kind of most first, if you like, prominent public example of not just a practitioner and someone who set up a nunnery here in India, which I've been to, which is great, Tilakpa nunnery, but she was translating text, and I think she was even translating for him orally as well. So in that respect, I think the 16th Karmapa was actually a kind of a pioneer in that respect. I think she was the first woman to be put in that position by a head of a lineage, and I have yet to see any other head of a lineage use a female translator, right, for any of their teachings. So that's quite interesting. But then there's another woman who's also considered to be an emanation of Vajrayana in Bhutan, who has a nunnery there. I don't know if you're aware of her. I don't know a lot about her. I've just read some things. She has a nunnery in Bhutan, and she's actually called Doji Padmo. But again, the question is, considering that she is recognized as an emanation of Vajrayana, and she is a living, breathing woman, and she has a nunnery in Bhutan. So again, why are we not hearing more about her? And there are even Western women who've been recognized as tulkus, some of whom you may have heard of. But again, my question is, how many of those women have really gained prominence as teachers in the way that male tulkus have? And again, I think this is another issue we need to look at. So, for example, there's an American woman who was recognized as an emanation of Madhurava, recognized by Peno Rinpoche. But since that time, I mean, I would say she hasn't really, considering who recognized her, been sort of by the sort of men, if you like, or the male lamas. She's not really been promoted that much. And again, this comes back to the whole issue is, even when there are female tulkus, even when there are female geshimas, even when there are female gelongmas, as I wrote about recently, where are the gelongmas? So there's been all this talk about fully ordained nuns, which is great. I completely think that's brilliant. But, where are these women? I mean, there's all this talk about it. So, I went to interview two of these women who were some of the kind of, if you like, first gelongmas in this kind of batch in the 20th century who were encouraged to take the full ordination. And, again, they've been kind of forgotten about. They haven't had that sort of support or promotion. And so part of my vision, or my personal sort of aim, is to sort of bring out these women, their lives more, and put them into the public sphere more, right? So that people can see there are these women that exist. It's just that, and again, that's why I set up Dakini Translations, was because I feel like so much of this stuff is just not getting the publicity it deserves, right? These women are not getting the promotion and publicity they deserve. And most of what we still see is still predominantly male-founded, male-directed, or male lamas, right? So when we start seeing panels or, women, which we are in America, for example, I think, there are more kind of gender equal panels, right? But certainly I would say, in India or Nepal, that has yet to happen. And even though there are, women and tulkus, even from within the tradition, they are not really being promoted or invited to these things. And the question we need to ask ourselves is why? So anyway, I hope that answered your question a bit. Maybe it didn't answer it so well. I was a little bit vague, but
no, it's very helpful and illuminating. I also have the question in response of, if we have all of these incredible female practitioners that are not in the public eye, I sometimes wonder if that's a blessing, as long as they're being supported in their practice and they are able to deepen. Maybe that's unseen blessing, because they're really able to, culminate or come, to more fruitional states in their own path rather than being in the public. But I also know many stories of women that aren't supported in their practice and need more support. So
I mean, this is an excellent point. So some people will say, well, women just generally don't want to be out there in the public eye. They don't want that kind of publicity. And again, that can be used as an excuse. I've also heard sort of patriarchal men or sexist men sort of say that, well, they just don't want it. Well, actually, no, because you never asked them, or so yeah, one has to be careful with that. But I do think there's an element also, again, looking at a woman. And why did Padmasambhava, for example, say that, if you're a woman, a female practitioner, and you have love and compassion and the renunciation, why will you attain enlightenment quicker than a man? Well, of course, there are reasons for that, because, let's say biologically speaking or something, but, as women, we tend to be more compassionate and loving. We tend to, being mothers, it comes easier to us. And so I think also what comes easier to women is not putting ourselves at the forefront, not wanting to be the leader or the head of the pack, let's say, and I think there is that sort of quality, which is actually also very valuable, I think. And it's, but, the problem is like you say, is it really because women are just don't want to be out there as teachers, or is it actually they're just not getting promoted or supported? They're being ignored, they're being bypassed in sort of fields like translation or academia, for example, particularly, even really well-known professors who've had some level of acceptance in the field still speak about how their work is continually, maybe not so much now, but before, was continually sort of undermined or ignored for less, in a way, sort of thorough or scholarly work. So I think this is it's a very difficult question, but I think, why is it important to have women out there publicly saying, as a teacher or as a practitioner, as a scholar or as a translator, is it's the role models, right? So I mentioned that, I really like Marpa, the translator, the role model, but how wonderful wouldn't it be to have a woman in the past because that's what we look for as well in role models. It's sorry to say it, but if you're a woman, it's good to see another woman being successful at that or doing that. And most of our role models that have been presented to us through Tibetan Buddhism with the tulkus have predominantly been male. And we've been okay with that. We've been able to adjust to that. But I just think how wonderful, and it is wonderful when we see women out there, for example, like Jessamine in Palmo, or, like, for example, some of the women you've interviewed on your podcast, when people can listen to those women and hear them and get some inspiration from that, because I think there's something very different as a woman seeing and hearing a woman talk about these things, for sure. And this is why Yeshe Sogyal and Mandarava, are some of the most popular women among Buddhist women, is because, they are such amazing role models, right? And Sera Khandro now as well, particularly.